General John Kelly, who later became Chief of Staff.
Welcome to What the F is Going On in Latin America and the Caribbean, CODEPINK's weekly YouTube program of hot news out of Latin America and the Caribbean. We, in partnership with Friends of Latin America, Massachusetts Peace Action, and Task Force on the Americas, we broadcast every Wednesday at 7:30 p.m. Eastern, 4:30 p.m. Pacific on CODEPINK YouTube Live. The inspiration for tonight's episode came during the 6th Summit of Heads of State and Government of the Community of Latin America and Caribbean States, also known as CELAC, C-E-L-A-C, which was held in Mexico City on September 18 of this year. One of the results of the summit was a special declaration on the question of Puerto Rico. And the declaration includes 2 points. Those being point 1, reaffirm the Latin American and Caribbean character of Puerto Rico and recognizing the efforts made and the resolutions adopted by the Special Committee on Decolonization of the United Nations about the situation on Puerto Rico, the most recent on June 18th, 2021, and reiterated that it is a matter of high interest to CELAC, as was emphasized at the highest level of the 5th Summit in Punta Cana, Dominican Republic, held January 25, 2017. And the second point being, undertake to continue working in the framework of international law, particularly of the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 1514, Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and People of December 14, 1960, to put an end quickly and unconditionally to colonialism in all its forms and manifestations in Latin America and the Caribbean region. Joining us today to talk about ending U.S. colonialism of Puerto Rico is my friend Monisha Rios. She is a Puerto Rican psychologist and social worker, and I'm so pleased to have her with us today. Welcome, Monisha.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure for us to finally be talking face to face, so to speak. So I should share with our audience, about an hour before we were scheduled to broadcast, Monisha sent me a WhatsApp message saying she lost electricity in Puerto Rico. And so let's just briefly tell the audience what that's about. And then let's go more deeply into, because it is an example of this neocolonial form, neoliberal form of colonialism, neocolonialism. That's a tongue twister for me, sorry.
Yeah, so Luma Energy is a Canadian and USAN company that was newly formed not that long ago and entered into a very questionable, very expensive contract with the Puerto Rican government through what they like to call a public-private partnership to basically take over our electrical grid in our country, our occupied nation of Puerto Rico. And so like what we have seen in our sister nations throughout Latin America and the Caribbean, when the privateers want to privatize, there's a systematic destabilization of essential services, a sabotage, if you will, to then try and create public support for this ridiculous, expensive policy. And unfortunately, what has happened now is that with this takeover of Luma, we're constantly losing power. Hundreds of thousands of Puerto Ricans are without power, sometimes weeks at a time. I'm lucky that it wasn't for a long period of time. And we're just having a minor thunderstorm right now. But in many places in Puerto Rico, folks have been without often. And there's a lot to share about that when we get into it.
Okay, so privatization is not the answer. It's glorified in the United States as the model, and here's one more just in the past hour, one more, prime example of why it doesn't work, which leads me to ask about disaster capitalism. This, because what you're seeing in Puerto Rico and what the rest of the world is witnessing is that since the hurricanes, there's been no relief from the United States, of which you are a part. You've kind of your infrastructure, your people have been left with no assistance except that help, or that, what do I want to say, rebuilding coming from the private sector.
I think the hurricanes did the private sector a favor, because even before then we had the crisis, our financial crisis happening, and that's a whole other layer of U.S. interventionism in Puerto Rico, is the Fiscal Control Board, what we call La Junta. And so the closing of universities, the lack of investment in infrastructure, our electrical grid was nationalized before this. Many of our essential services were more on the nationalized side of the spectrum. And naturally, when that got wiped out, it was weak already, in large part because of a lack of investment on the part of the Puerto Rican government in the needs of the people, in making sure that basic needs could be met in times of disaster. And as you said, now we have this new wave of colonialism happening, these new settlers coming in droves to have their way with us, because what defenses do we have?
It's a particularly, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. I need to also mention, especially because I'm Viacense, that Puerto Rico is not just the big islands of Puerto Rico that everyone thinks of. There's also Culebra and Vieques, two little islands to the east of the bigger island, and my family comes from the little one called Vieques, which the U.S. happened to bomb for 60 years, and prior to that, the U.S. bombed Culebra for that many decades as well, until we've resisted. What that means for us now, in terms of disaster relief, we have no hospital. We haven't had a hospital since the hurricanes, and prior to that, the healthcare there was minimal and inadequate anyway. So that's a whole other ball of wax to get into at some point.
Well, so, gosh, I have like 10 things I want to ask you simultaneously. So Vieques was a naval proving ground, testing ground, basically. Yeah. And then as far as Puerto Rico being a colony, is so clearly called out in this recent declaration coming out of SELAC, let's talk a little. Can you give our audience just I know this is a huge question to ask you to condense, but a really quick background as to Puerto Rico and how Puerto Rico came to be colonized by the United States, or as a commonwealth, I think is the nice word, that like Guam.
Yeah.
The commonwealth.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the U.S., as we know, has always had its eyes on our region, the Latin American Caribbean region. And when all of the disturbance in the Spanish Empire was taking place, you had the Bolivarian Revolution, you had the Cuban Revolution taking place, you had Puerto Ricans wanting independence from Spain as well. And we actually had 4 days of being independent from Spain before the U.S. invaded in 1898, July 25th to be exact. So essentially, because the U.S. wanted the gateway into Latin America through the Caribbean, which is us here in Puerto Rico, and they also wanted the sugar industry, they wanted what Spain had. They created this illusion, as always, of coming in as saviors. We're going to help liberate you.
It's been the same narrative for 200 years.
Yeah, I mean, switch it up, you guys. Come on. It's, so long story short, there was a small group of Puerto Ricans who, like all ruling classes, have proven to be, their economic interests aligned with the United States. So they made the invitation to come. Please come liberate us and make us a part of you. All of this, of course, occurred without the consent and the will of the people of Puerto Rico. And unlike Cuba, there was never an intention of making Puerto Rico its own country. There was always the intention of holding on to us because we are the what do they call it? The pearl of the Caribbean or some stupid thing like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so then leading up to the Commonwealth status, this is like a complete falsehood. It's just a way of when classic colonialism became unfashionable in the world, suddenly here's the United States, supposedly the bastion of human rights, and they have a colony, a blatant colony. And so then putting this so-called partial sovereignty in place by saying that we have like a somewhat independent nation that's freely associated with the United States, that moved us off of the UN's list of actually colonized countries into the self-governing list of countries. So that's why most of the world forgets that, oh yeah, that we still have this colony of the United States.
Well, you know, you and I have spent a lot of time in Venezuela and other parts of the Americas for almost every country I've been in, and this may be your experience as well. Puerto Rico is referred to when we say the United States and Puerto Rico. And I think that that's super important from an independence, international standpoint, but it also can infer, yeah, the United States, and then there's Puerto Rico, which is not a state, which is like in verbosity and language, it's no longer a colony, quote unquote, it's a commonwealth. So what are you? What is Puerto Rico? What is Puerto Rico? How do the people of Puerto Rico identify? And maybe this digs into some of your psychology. Maybe this.
Yeah. So getting into the psychology of colonialism and psychological warfare, which is actually my specialty, is we can look at this through the lens of U.S. hybrid warfare in the context of Puerto Rico, in the context of classic colonialism. The narratives that have been sort of cultivated within the minds of many Puerto Ricans is that, you know, they're happy to be part of the United States. Many are happy to remain in this limbo status that we have. Many, like myself, would prefer complete, total sovereignty and independence. And then there are also some who would like to go the way of Palau and enter into a compact of free association, which is very similar to what we already have, where the U.S. would control our foreign policy and basically dominate us as a neocolony instead of a purely classical colony. So for me, speaking for myself and other independentistas, we are an occupied sovereign nation. We are a sovereign nation that is occupied politically, economically, and continues to be occupied militarily, although the landscape of that particular type of occupation has shifted over time.
Wow. So free association, that's a new term for me. In relation to Puerto Rico, free association. That's basically what you are now. Or what
that's what they call us, a freely associated state.
Wow. So meaning it's like your choice. It's free, you're free.
Exactly.
I see.
Exactly.
Okay. But that's not exactly true, because now you, as those of you who are citizens of Puerto Rico, are US citizens, but not fully.
Correct.
And so what does that mean?
So the Jones Act of 1917 imposed citizenship on Puerto Ricans in order for the U.S. to then draft us into World War I. So there are some benefits go with this partial citizenship. When we reside here in the homeland, we cannot vote for president. We have limited rights. There are certain benefits of U.S. citizenship, benefits of imperialism that we don't get. But then when we cross the pond to the empire, then you can vote for president. I have a U.S. passport. I have a social security number.
So if you move to Washington, well, no, that wouldn't count Washington D.C. They don't have full. So you move to like, Burlington, Vermont, where I'm from. You could vote for president.
Mm-hmm.
If you establish that as your principal residence, but you could not do that with your principal residence being on Vieques.
Correct.
Oh, wow. Okay. Oh, this is getting worse. I'm embarrassed that I don't know this in more detail. I mean, I know all these things on a more surface level, but not to this detail as to how they affect like your actual daily life, even though you have
That's
a
by
US
design.
passport. Yeah, no, clearly. I didn't know about, the drafting for World War I purposes, and that's, but yeah, wow. It's more convoluted and more oppressive than I, really realized actually. So earlier you brought up, hybrid war in connection with colonialism. So let's talk about the various forms of hybrid war being placed on Puerto Rico.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about that. Because generally when, those of us who are against imperialism, who are against U.S. interventionism, speak about hybrid war, we speak about it in relationship to America Latina and other countries. So in relationship to Puerto Rico, it helps to understand hybrid warfare as we know it today in modern times as just the evolution of total war, which has always existed. And total war begins with narrative. Hybrid war begins with narrative. And then all other aspects such as kinetic warfare, lawfare, the diplomatic warfare, economic warfare, all of that then gets imposed on Puerto Rico through this colonial narrative. So it looks different than what's being done to our relatives in Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, etc. With us, our colonial condition leads us to live in sanction-like conditions. So it's an economic sanction of its own type. It's a diplomatic.
And what does that look like?
So that looks
we
like.
Say this, we think of like for you and me, our work we do with Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, and other countries, and soon to be Nicaragua. Hopefully not, but for our audience, it means cutting off access to the U.S. overnight banking system, to international financial institutions, and freezing assets held overseas, and on and on and on. And so is that similar to Puerto Rico as well?
No.
Or
so
what do you mean?
Certain features of the neocolonial economic warfare is different than the colonial hybrid warfare. So what we have now is that Fiscal Control Board enacted by President Obama. It's the Promesa Act, which is essentially due to the effects of settler colonialism, due to the collaboration between our ruling political and economic elite and the U.S. ruling political and economic elite. Puerto Ricans in the lower classes have always struggled in many ways that poor citizens of the U.S. struggle, in many ways that poor citizens of Latin America and the Caribbean struggle. So what it looks like right now under the control of this Fiscal Control Board, which was appointed by the President of the United States, not voted in by the Puerto Ricans.
The president you couldn't vote for, right?
The president you cannot vote for has appointed now these overseers over your government. They can veto any law that's created by the Puerto Rican government. Natalie Jaresko, whose name might sound familiar from Ukraine, who was one of the top dogs in the International Monetary Fund, World Bank. She is in charge of our fiscal control board. So all of these austerity measures that we see happening in our neighboring countries are happening to us. The privatization is happening to us. The limited access is happening to us. When I say limited access, I mean, obviously we don't control our foreign policy. We don't control trade with other nations. We can only do what the US tells us we are allowed to do. So we cannot enjoy the solidarity of Cuba. We cannot trade with Venezuela. There's no chance. And then in the case of Vieques and Culebra, the two islands that resisted U.S. militarism and colonial rule the most, the living conditions there are closer to what they are in Cuba and closer to what they are in Venezuela than the rest of Puerto Rico. Because you have the punishment of the U.S. government, and this punishment isn't necessarily in the same vein as it is against Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba, where they've resisted, and so now, just like an abusive spouse, I'm going to steal all of your money and threaten to kill your children. This is instead for maintenance. It is to control the colony. It is to suppress any type of resistance. It's to destabilize our independence movement and anything that we might do to live in our full sovereignty, to have control over our natural resources. Anything that we try to do to enjoy food sovereignty, to cut off our dependency on imported goods from the U.S. It gets killed right away.
That's what's been done to Haiti as well. Yeah, importing, yeah, wow. So creating markets.
Creating markets
also for the private sector. Yeah.
Creating markets for the private sector, and then using us to protect the imperial project. And to carry out the imperial project as well. So in many ways, we're like Colombia, or the Israel of the Caribbean.
Yeah, you're that base from which everything.
Exactly.
Well, I remember, there's a military airstrip in Puerto Rico that I think was being refurbished, as the sanctions regime against Venezuela has been getting, more and more stringent, and now, Venezuela is surrounded, has Colombia to the west, and for a while had a right-wing government in Bolivia to the south, and then this Puerto Rican U.S. airstrip to the north. It was pretty obvious if you looked at the map what the intention. When I was a young person, we called that containment. It was, and maybe still that term is still used, but yeah. So other forms of hybrid warfare.
So going back to the, sorry. I didn't
No, go ahead.
over you.
I'm talking over you, so I apologize.
Oh gosh, no, it's a great conversation. The CELAC statement that you read in the beginning. So when we talk about the diplomatic warfare that relates to the colonial condition of Puerto Rico, the way that Puerto Rico is discussed in the international community matters. The way that Puerto Rico is discussed inside the United States also matters. And so you can see, as you were saying before, the difference in those two narratives. So what our sister nations in CELAC have done with their statement is affirm our sovereignty, which is
33 nations. Well, I think 31 participated. Yeah.
Affirm our sovereignty.
33 of the 35 that make up the Americas. Yeah, is CELAC. Yeah. -2 this year, Brazil and Colombia. So it was 31 nations that signed that declaration out of 35.
Minus the two vassal states.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's understandable. But it's so necessary. So when we talk about the diplomatic warfare element of colonial hybrid warfare and how that narrative works, for example, there's a good reason why you don't know the specifics of the Puerto Rican struggle over time, as well as, let's say, we do our sister nations in Latin America and Cuba. And it's because how is Puerto Rico talked about in the United States, especially within the anti-war movement, the anti-imperialist movement? How is it discussed?
We don't talk about it enough, which is why you're joining us tonight.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which
And
is why
there's a
we're doing
reason
this
for that.
episode. Is no, we do not talk about it enough. I mean,
And there's
we
a
really
reason
don't.
for that.
It's, yeah, because it's, and it may be different. You know, I grew up on the West Coast of the United States. So perhaps, you know, our orientation was a lot more to what was happening with the people on the islands of Hawaii. Maybe it's more common for people on the Gulf Coast of the United States and the East Coast to look, you know, to Puerto Rico. But it's really almost a nebulous thing. It's like, well, yeah, they're part of us. They're not a state. You know, at one point when I was younger, there was an election to vote for statehood. It didn't pass. I want to say that was in the 70s.
1967.
67. Okay. So
You're
I was
close.
alive then too. So I was already born by then too. So I do remember. Yeah. So I think it's hard, you know, and then a lot of us know the struggle of, you know, Oscar Roberto Lopez. And of course, he was labeled a terrorist on mainland United States. So, you know, it's a really, I would say in general, you've been silenced.
Yes.
Yeah, I would say in general, it's been, you know, a silencing or kind of swept under the carpet, so to speak. Yeah. I would say that's probably, unfortunately, that's probably the general perception.
And part of it too, so if sometime I hope maybe there's a chance for us to really dive into that, because it fascinates me at the same time that it terrifies me.
Yeah.
Because when you look at like how people who are anti-imperialist in aspiration, yet are pro-colonial in action and behavior, discuss Puerto Rico, it's a matter of, in part, it's a matter of there's this mirror that one needs to look into as a resident of the imperial core, as someone who was directly involved in settler colonialism. I have to ask myself these questions and confront these things in myself all the time too, because Puerto Rico has also has its own colonial history to contend with and make amends for, being part of the Spanish Empire at one point.
Right.
But almost annihilating the indigenous, my ancestors, the indigenous people here, and then, you know, participating willingly in slavery. So, you know, some of the ways that I found in my own experience of being involved in the US-based movements for anti-war, anti-imperialism, et cetera, is that when it comes to the moment that we can really talk about Puerto Rico, it's like people get nervous. There's this hesitation. Part of it is the, you know, the relationship we all have to settler colonialism. But then part of it too is the way that you've been taught and groomed to react and to treat the conversation about Puerto Rico. Because going back to that vote you mentioned, the first plebiscite for whether or not we become a state, stay the same, or become independent, was in 1967, on the tail end of Cuban Revolution, when the US is desperately needing to control narratives about liberation in Latin America and the Caribbean. And when there's this mythology around choice, the mythology that is fed to US citizens is that Puerto Ricans make a choice, that it's a free choice.
Yes, right. And in the more recent years, that choice the ballot was completely manipulated to intentionally confuse people. Well, that I would say that happens on, you know, pretty much every ballot when you vote in the United States. But I remember there was an intentional omission or language manipulation so people would not vote for independence.
Yeah.
Am I remembering that correctly? Yeah.
Yep,
Yeah.
you are correct. Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, and that, yeah. When it comes to our plebiscites, it's helpful, I think, and maybe you can help me encourage our colleagues in these movements to view how our politics take place here, and particularly how the colonial politics take place, is to think about the electoral interference that the U.S. is doing in other countries. We're having the same thing. It's just a different question.
To U.S. citizens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's to stop us from not being property of the United States anymore. And it's to create the illusion of choice, and it is to manipulate a narrative. So there have always been boycotts from that first vote in 1967, and there have been, I think, 6, if I'm remembering correctly, since then, the most recent in the past year, 2020. And each time there's direct interference and indirect interference from the United States, who is our master, right? Our slave owner, our dominant abuser.
Your colonizer.
Holding our colonizer, holding our children over our heads, holding our health over our heads, holding our economics over our heads, holding it all over our heads with this narrative that you will not survive without us. So you have to stay married to us, even though
even though it's abusive.
Marriage, even though it's abusive. And our ruling class, which benefits from this arrangement, is carrying the narrative out, and they profit from it. They profit so much. So there are sectors of the independence movement who rightfully boycott because they understand and they see that this is a whole farce. This whole concept of voting yes or no to independence or statehood or this or that, it's just a farce, right? It's a game that they play with us to keep us sort of focused on that instead of fighting for our liberation. And
thinking you actually have a choice, the mirage of having a choice. Yeah.
Because no matter what, so it was more like a 50-50 vote in this last one. So even if the votes for independence had surpassed even by 1%, then it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if we voted 100% for independence, because the ones who really have the power to make that decision according to that political and electoral method of achieving our liberty is the United States Congress.
Right.
So the only thing that the plebiscite does for us is supposedly amplifies the voices, the majority of Puerto Ricans, to Congress, and it's like a recommendation.
It's like
take it into consideration.
It's a registration of public opinion. That's all.
That's it. It's just a very corrupt survey.
Corrupt survey. I like that's good. Yeah. What do the majority of the people want? Okay, independence. Well, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. And
do you
the
have
thing,
representation? This is a really naive question of mine. You cannot vote for president, so the president doesn't represent you, but does make decisions for what happens to you as Puerto Rican citizens. And you do have representation in Congress, sort of like DC has representation, but nothing that's actually capable of voting and influencing.
right.
Yeah.
We have a puppet in DC.
A puppet, a name and a face. Yeah, but no actual power.
Yeah. A name and a face that's directly in line with imperialism, and it's just there as another farce.
Yeah, a token. So, when you and I first talked about doing this episode, we had like a laundry list of things that we wanted to talk about. So what do we need to talk about next? Hybrid warfare, and what's the future for Puerto Rico? What are the people that you live with? How do assuming the majority want independence, how is that possible? Do you see that as a greater possibility now as the global economy and as politics become more multilateral? Is it a greater possibility? And I really, our audience hears multilateral almost every episode, but it is the way the majority of the world outside of the United States, it is the paradigm that the majority of nations function in. Is the United States that's still functioning in a unilateral paradigm.
Right, that they create. Yes, so there's more hope now. There's more tangible hope and tangible reason to be hopeful now than there ever has been before. A lot of it has to do with those austerity measures, with the way that especially our youth are living in our current material conditions and are fed up. They're angry, and to their credit, I really admire them because their perception is correct for the most part. So you see, for example, in the last elections that took place, there were more votes than ever before for the Puerto Rican Independence Party. So there are some destabilizing forces. So you know how the U.S. will create political parties to disrupt and destabilize what could be democratic processes in other countries? The same happens here. So, with the whole feminist imperialist bent that the U.S.
take
has
advantage
now.
of those,
Yeah.
and then fund the parties,
And
we see that all over the Americas,
and fund the parties
within the
through
United States
NGOs.
as well.
Yeah. So we have that too. So right now there's a party that is kind of like a destabilizing force to shake things up. Again, it's multi-tendency. There are really good people involved in it who, are caught up, and then there are people that know exactly what they're doing. So many of the people that would have put their trust and faith in the Puerto Rican Independence Party, for example, voting for a PEEP candidate for governor, did not. They voted for the identity politic queen. Yeah.
See, isn't that's one of the things, and that's really disconcerting, and something that we all need to be aware of is the identity politics, because just because someone looks a certain way, dresses a certain way, identifies a certain way, doesn't mean that they're not neoliberal. I mean, it's like, right, we've changed the face of neoliberalism, but we haven't changed the project. Change it, much less destroy it. We've changed the face of it. And that actually, to me, makes it more scary and more threatening, because now it can appear to be more palpable to more people. And I just wish we could just, become for lack of a better term, a melting pot politically. We like to say in the United States that we are a melting pot of people from all over the world, and somehow we've chosen to put ourselves back into these individual silos, and it's obscuring our vision on a lot of things. Yeah.
I learn a lot from the Red Nation, and I really pay attention to what Indigenous elders and Indigenous youth are teaching us, especially now. They're the people that we really need to be listening to and following the lead of.
They're the vanguard of humanity, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, they're going to save the planet and the humans if we let them.
If we get out of the way. And when I say Indigenous, I also mean Indigenous African. And so something that has occurred to me recently, and it's really one of the reasons why I focus so much on narrative and on psychological warfare, because that is the basis of all the other things. The narratives that we're taught about one another They come from colonialism, they come from imperialism, they come from the capitalist project, and they're there specifically, as you know, to divide us. And something that was said recently is that we would still be coming together, trading together, living together from our different nations, societies, and cultures, even if colonialism did not exist, because that is the natural way of humanity, to migrate, to fall in love, to create new societies together, to share art, to share culture, to build together. And so that's where we can really focus our energies, is that, yes, we've all been socialized in the US, especially toward colonialism, toward a mentality and a worldview that maybe we don't want. It isn't natural for us, but it's what we've been raised in. So there's that whole unlearning work. But in terms of how we build relationship with one another, as now it's an imperative for us to come together and learn how to work together and be relatives to save the planet from ourselves, or from capitalism,
Well, it's a divide and conquer thing. I mean, it's very Machiavellian, very simple. I mean, all the way back to, the art of war, that divide and conquer and keep people, separate versus, the same as one species, which we are. we just happen, to have different physical attributes. I remember when I was still living on the California coast in West Marin, I used to do a lot of hiking, and I was out one day with some friends of mine, and we walked past this meadow filled with deer of all ages and sizes. And, some were reddish, some were kind of white, some were little, some were big, some were old, some were young. And one of the people I was walking with said, I have to take this picture of this meadow. And I said, well, what's it going to be called? Colorblind. Because here they were all sharing the same food source, the same space, no problem, nobody pushing someone out, nobody, yeah. And I just, when I have these conversations, just remember that afternoon, because it was I don't think I realized how poignant it was. I mean, we knew it was a special moment and a special title for that moment, but it keeps recurring. That moment keeps coming back to me so many times. And it's been like 10 years since I've had that walk. But yeah, colorblind. So, here are these animals, as are we, sharing the space, sharing the food, sharing each other's friendship. And it was a really special thing. I want to ask you before I let you go, gosh, I feel like we could just talk all evening, quite frankly. And so you're going to have to come back.
Thank you.
And continue this. But one of the things I'm sure our audience is begging for me to ask you about, because this has come up the past year, every country that we've touched on. What's the situation with COVID-19 in Puerto Rico?
It's hard to tell, to be honest. Sometimes we don't have data.
Is that intentional?
I think it is.
Or just lack of infrastructure, or all of the above. Maybe.
I think it's an intentional lack of infrastructure and a lack of support for the people who are ethical in doing their jobs. Because we could not close our borders, essentially, and we had to continue receiving tourism from the United States and whoever the United States decided to allow. We've had many escalations of cases. More recently, we had a really bad one. Although, again, the data is questionable. But
see, isn't this, this is just amazing to me, because we don't hear this in the mainland United States. What we do hear is how bad it is in Cuba and how they're not responding. How bad it is in all these other places, particularly countries not aligned with the United States, who I would argue many of them have done a far better job addressing the pandemic. But yeah, I mean, it's a sin, actually, that we're, our own citizens.
The vaccination rates have been good.
Okay. So you've had access. So yeah. Well, that's encouraging.
And so thankfully there's that, but then, the same things that were happening in the more right wing. So something to definitely understand about Puerto Rico is our current government, like the statehood party is fascist. And there are a couple other parties that are very fascist. And under their control, I mean, we've had openings before we should have opened. These last outbreaks, they should have closed everything down again, but didn't. Instead, there became this really kind of hateful, dehumanizing campaign against people who haven't been vaccinated. Instead of meeting human need, once again, it was all about forcing
put the
people
economy
back to work.
first, and the private sector first, and the people second. Wow, that's really. Well, I'm happy to hear about the vaccination rate, the access to vaccines, and the vaccination rate. That's encouraging, hopeful. So, when you think of Puerto Rico as an island, it could have been, very, very easy to literally shut down access. And just get get everybody healthy and vaccinated, and then reopen, which is what Cuba is planning to do. Get everybody healthy, get 90% of the country vaccinated, and then they'll reopen, and they themselves will be safe from for tourists, and the tourists will be safe too. I mean, it's a win-win for everybody. And with an island, it's it's logistically so much easier to do it than any of the states sitting in the middle of the United States, of the continental United States. So what else should we talk about? What do you want to make sure what point do you want to make sure we raise this evening before I let you go?
So I know that a common conversation you've been having lately on your show has been around cryptocurrency.
Yes.
And that is.
And you and I talked about that actually after one, or while I was preparing for one episode.
Yes. Yep.
I think the El Salvador episode. We were talking about that because it is controversial.
It is. I'm so thankful too that you dialogued with me about it, because as soon as I saw what the subject matter was, I felt this pain in my chest, like, oh God, not El Salvador. But so yes, on the one hand, cryptocurrency is saving the lives of many of our relatives in sanctioned nations, right? We see that as a workaround, and
the Swiss banking system and the U.S. petrodollar and all of those things, which is my orientation to cryptocurrency and Bitcoin, and being able to use it on PayPal now.
So obviously, like, all money is just a tool, right? No matter what form it takes, digital or paper. It doesn't have any meaning until you give it meaning, and it has no action until you give it action, right? So the meaning and the action of cryptocurrency in Puerto Rico is colonialism. It's not a salvation for us. It is yet another imposition, and it is another form of disaster capitalism that we have been imposed upon with. Brock Pierce, who is a child star who was in the Mighty Ducks, came here after the hurricanes, trying to save Puerto Rico with Bitcoin. And all he's done is act like a colonizer. He's buying up buildings left and right, historic buildings. He walks himself around like he's the president of Puerto Rico. And then after him came this influx of crypto colonizers. And the way that your guest from El Salvador explained that was very good. that essentially, you know, this is just the new money. This is just the new wave of colonizers coming here, mostly from the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Mostly coming here because Puerto Rico is a tax haven,
Oh,
because
right.
it is an island,
Mm-hmm.
because there are so many incentives. So there's the Act 2022, and then there's another one, 61, I believe. I hope someone will correct me on that if I'm wrong. I'm sure they will. That there's all these real estate incentives, there's all these business incentives to encourage more and more settlers to come here. Because always
in Bitcoin, but what was the why did this why is it being done via Bitcoin and not US dollars? What's the
I think it's
thinking behind that?
I think it's just because it happened to be the Bitcoin bros, as we call them,
Yeah.
that came.
Yeah.
And they're the ones with the money right now. So there's a new.
But it's the same system. It's just a different coinage, basically. It's the same. It's the same
exactly
system.
it.
It's still disaster capitalism, and yeah, they're just using a different currency versus the US dollar. Yeah. I would also argue it's a generational thing too.
Yeah.
In part.
It once was gold and silver, then it became paper money. Now it's digital money. But it's the same people, the same type of person doing the same type of thing.
Right.
And then when, you know, we talk about the electrical grid, how long, or so let's just hypothetically suppose that cryptocurrency could help Puerto Ricans around the colonial sanctions that we're living under, if it could help us reduce our dependency on the United States in some way. There's no way that the majority of Puerto Ricans who live under the poverty line as established by the United States, who many live in the mountains, many live without internet. There's no way.
Also, there's no way to use an electronic wallet if you don't have internet, which was the argument made against the introduction of cryptocurrency in El Salvador too, was the access. And that guest, I should just remind our audience, that guest was Yesenia Portillo from CISPIS in Washington, D.C. Yeah, she was.
Yeah, she did great.
Very knowledgeable about it.
Yeah. And so it's similar for us here, and it's really done just again as another neoliberal colonial project. It's not to liberate.
It's the same model. We're not talking about, dismantling neoliberalism.
Right.
Yeah, it's just it's the same model, new tool.
Yeah.
Not even a new tool. It's still money. it's
exactly,
new coinage.
It's still money.
it's new
just
coinage.
A new form.
Yeah.
So, and the other question is what is the environmental impact actually? And have we had enough time to assess that? And is there an ethical way of using it? And this is something that I would love to hear from our Indigenous relatives on what they think is, what is their perspective on this? Because knowing that the US and those who love to control the monetary system of the world will definitely put out a particular narrative to draw people away from anything that counters that. That challenges their domination, right? Cryptocurrency now. So it's hard for the average person like myself to know when we look at this article that's maybe from a reputable source, a trusted source, about the ecological impact of cryptocurrency, crypto mining. And those of us who have climate change in the forefront of our minds, how do we move forward with this new technology responsibly, ethically, and in a way that's not actually putting us backwards in the fight to save the planet, but will propel us forward? So it's another big question that comes up in Puerto Rico a lot.
Yeah. Well, it's a big, boy, we'll have to have a conversation just on that as we watch it evolve, unfortunately, in Puerto Rico and see what it's doing. Yeah. So Monisha, I want to thank you so much for joining us this evening. And I'm so happy the audience should know that the light stayed on for you. We weren't sure. The privatized electrical grid that was once public infrastructure doesn't function on any sort of, and doesn't service the majority of citizens either. Which is, yeah. So I'm glad that we were able to to talk. I want you to come back, and I also think that we should talk about, a delegation to Puerto Rico.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
We should do that.
Definitely.
Early next year. Yeah, I think it would be, a good exploration and study, to really dig deep into to what's going on there. I think it'd be enormously educational for a wide variety of people from the mainland United States. But, so thank you again. And I want to remind our audience that you've been watching What the F is Going On in Latin America and the Caribbean, CODEPINK's weekly YouTube program. We broadcast every Wednesday night, 7:30 p.m. Eastern, 4:30 p.m. Pacific. And also I should remind all of you that of CODEPINK Radio, which broadcasts on Thursday mornings, 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific, out of WBAI New York City, simulcasting on WPFW out of Washington, D.C. And you can find both episodes of What the F is Going On in Latin America and CODEPINK Radio on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So there's my pitch. So, okay, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, everybody.